I am Sid Harvey. I am originally from Chicago. I grew up in the south side of Chicago. Any Chicago people in the room? Any Chicago people? No? I'm alone today. The things you need to know about me. 20 years experience. When I say I've done 20 years experience of diversity consulting work, I've done work with kids, adults, inside the state of Michigan, outside the state of Michigan, for our federal government, profit, nonprofit, schools, churches. The reason I say all this is because you need to know you're in good hands. And why do I say that? And one of the biggest things I've learned in my 20 years of doing this work is when we find out that we have to sign up for a diversity training, or we're going to a diversity training, very few of us come in here going, yeah. A lot of us come in here going, okay, who do I need to watch out for? Am I going to be the one being picked on? Do I have to have my defenses up? So one of the things I really like to try to do in all my trainings is promise you one thing. No shame, no blame. You're not going to get shamed from me. You're not going to get blamed from me. That's not the point of my training time. That's not the point of what you're going to come here and grow with. We get enough shame and blame in the world. Am I right? Especially on this topic. The reason I'm saying this is because it's really important for us to have a sense of honesty. If we're really going to grow today, we need to be honest with ourselves. Outside these four walls is more than enough shame and blame on this topic. But the truth is, if we want to really grow on this topic, we've got to take some time to step back, examine yourself, and ask yourself, what am I going to do? What can I do differently? Because until you can do that, all you do is shame and blame. Because all we do is point fingers. So we got to do some ownership. So we're going to talk some more about that. But in order to do that, I'm a real big believer. I already talked about my goals. We're going to look at some academic terms I think that's really wrong. I'll just say that. And then we're going to talk about the importance of our stories and our experience and how we need to understand if I don't know my story and who I am, I really can't begin to move forward on this topic. Not only that, as a social worker, if I don't know my story and I'm working with a family, how can I get this family to understand they have a great story? Because that's one of the problems. We don't see ourselves as these great beings who have a lot to offer. We get trapped into society believing that we're this or that. And if you've been in social work long enough, you know the families that become the Hollywood ending stories are the ones who grasp onto their own story and find strength in themselves. Am I making sense? And so if I don't think I have a great story, or if I don't even know my story, how am I going to get somebody else to believe theirs? So we're going to do that today. One of the things I've also learned doing my work here, I know I'm supposed to be standing still because I'm on the camera, but I'm having a hard time with that. So bear with me. I got to be myself. So one of the things I've learned doing this work is that you can't do this work without experiencing some of it. It's really easy to go to a classroom and get taught a lot of stuff. It's real easy, and those who are educators in the room, I'm sorry, I'm not trying to offend you, but I'm going to be honest that when we have people graduate with MSWs, and they can go and say, I had my 2 diversity classes, I know it all. That doesn't help. The truth is we have a lot of people graduated with MSWs who go into the field who don't realize diversity changes every day. Our world's changing every day. So that class I took in my undergrad work, outdated. That class I took last spring to get my MSW, outdated. You have to understand you have to constantly work. So what I'm going to do today as well is I'm going to give you some activities that I want you to take with you in your work and constantly ask yourself how to improve your work and how you see diversity. The first one is a real easy one. I'm going to ask you, and I'm going to participate as well, what's your favorite food? Think about that. Give it about 5-7 seconds. You don't need a lot because we all eat. Think about your favorite food. And then what I want to do is, and this is kind of a low-risk activity, I just want to try to get at least 3 or 4 people. Share with me your favorite food. Anybody? Why?
Because it's low fat, satisfying, and it's just delicious.
Okay. All right. Now listen to our responses. Somebody else.
Spaghetti.
Where? Okay.
Spaghetti.
What?
Spaghetti.
Spaghetti. Why?
Because I remember our big family, there were 11 of us. Those
One more. Why? Oh, sorry. Why? It's a part of your culture. Now let's stop for a second. Think about all the things that people say. Listen to that. Now listen to my story. Now, one of the things which I'll talk about a little bit later is I love barbecue. I love it. I love barbecue. I grew up in Chicago. And barbecue for me is more than just barbecue. It's an event. So you need to understand, in my family, when we decide to barbecue, whoever is the grill master, and a grill master is not a lightly term. That's a serious term. You know, and just to give you examples, that when we have the person set the grill out, they put a yellow rope around the grill. And if you're not a grill master, you don't dare do this. You know, not even just say, let me get you some charcoal, you hand water across the line. So they started like at 6 in the morning of meat that was marinated the night before, so we can eat by 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Now, the reason I tell you this, and as you listen to this, I'm telling you a little bit about myself. It's delicious. It's low fat. I've already just learned some things about her, how she thinks about herself and her diet. And I'm serious. So that's part of her story. Big family. It's part of my culture. Let me just stop real quick. See how easy this activity is? You've already begun to learn about somebody's story by what they eat. My question, once again, which is going to be throughout my time here, are you really listening to people's stories? If you're really listening to people's stories, you begin to understand and see them more than what you see physically. Because that's the true key about somebody's story. The more you know about me, hopefully by the end of the day, you'll realize it has a lot more to do with what's inside me than what's outside me. Does that make sense? All right. Hopefully you'll use that. Let's keep going. So here's the term we're going to talk about today. We're talking about diversity, culture, inclusion, linguistics, technical and adaptive problems. First one's diversity. Now, I put a picture of a salad bowl up there because I'll be honest, I've really struggled with this over the years, that a lot of people always talk about diversity and they say a melting pot. And I really struggle with that image. I'm a word picture guy, I'm a story guy. Hopefully you'll hear that today. That the term a melting pot, think about that. A melting pot means that we got to force two things together, right? I had a friend who was a welder. He was a welder all his life. He talked to me about when you start talking about a melting pot and melting things, you got to burn it. Think about that. You got to burn it. You got to burn both of them. And then you got to put them together. Anybody's ever done any plumbing work or seen plumbing work, and you see two objects burned, you can tell where they were burned and melted together. And I tell you, I don't want to be a part of a melting pot. Somebody got to burn me. I'm just being honest. What's good about you and I getting to be better friends, and we both got to get burned to do that? I think there's something wrong with that word picture. So I want to challenge you to think about diversity as the quality of being different, but think about it as a salad bowl. Now, here's the cool thing about a salad bowl. If I take a salad bowl, no matter what I put in it, for example, no matter how many tomatoes you put in the salad, and they line up about a crouton will not turn into a tomato, and the tomato will not turn into the crouton. But yet, when they're together, they make an interesting taste. But they don't have to give up anything. The crouton is still hard, crunchy. Tomato still soft and juicy. That's what diversity is supposed to be. It's supposed to be the salad bowl. No matter what I put in there, I'm only adding to it. And no matter what I put in there, something's not saying, okay, I can't be what I am anymore. I got to change. I'm by the lettuce. You know how the lettuce is. When the lettuce gets in the salad bowl, it's all about their rules, so I got to change. That's not what it's about. And then the other thing I want to throw to you is that if I took that salad bowl and I said, we're going to have salad for lunch, but first I have to blend it up and chop it all up, then I'm going to serve it to you, I can guarantee you most of them will be like, I'll pass. Then why would we want to do that with diversity? Why does diversity always have to be about mashing, mixing, melting things together? Why can't we begin to see it like this circle? You can sit by her and be yourself. You don't have to sit by her and change. That's what diversity should be. And that's what we need to look at. So let me stop for a second. Does that make sense to people? Any pushback, questions, thoughts? Because as I go through these terms, I want to make sure that we all understand, because I think these are really important terms for us as we have conversations later today. And not to put you on the spot, Karen, I had a great conversation about this whole thing that we don't need to give up to be a part of something. And I think that's one of the traps when we start talking about diversity. Linguistics. Now, linguistics to me is just a fancy term for how we communicate. But we need to understand we communicate more than just another language. We also communicate through sign language, slang, tone, song. Think about the youth culture. The youth culture has always been a culture that communicates through music, right? And slang. And if you're not up on it, you feel lost. But that is linguistics. Linguistics are really important. And I'm going to share a story with you about how important they are from a light way, but also a more serious way. The light way to tell you is that, like I shared with you before, I love barbecue. That's one of my favorite foods because it has a lot of deep meaning for me. So when I first moved to Grand Rapids from Chicago, I had a hard time, I'm going to stress the word, hard time finding barbecue. I was living there. I was there. You know, I was there, and I looked, and I couldn't find it. Now, you and I need to have a conversation. You saying all this stuff that I can relate to. But I still was striking out, finding real places that connected to home for me. So I had a friend who said, you know what, I know you missed that so much. We're going to make barbecue on Sunday. Come by our house. Oh, I'm excited now. I'm excited. Sunday rolls around, I'm driving up. Now you got to understand, like I talked about, for me, barbecue, the word barbecue has certain images. So as I'm pulling up, I'm expected to see smoke. There is no smoke. And it's not because it's such a hot day, but there is no smoke. So as I drive in the driveway, I'm not seeing that social cue, so I stop and say to myself, let's not be judgmental. Understand that some people do it in the stove, and they do a great job in the stove. Or some people do it in the backyard, maybe the smoke's being blocked. So I get out of my car and I'm walking, I said, let me just check the backyard. Because I'm looking for the barrel grill. Those who know what I'm talking about. Yeah, the barrel grill. That's what I'm looking for. So as I start to walk towards the backyard, my friend pops out the house. Hey, come on in. We're ready to eat. My heart did sink a little bit. I must admit. But I said, still be open. Still be open. So I get sitting in. I sit down at the table. And I realize as I'm sitting at the table, I'm kind of peeking at the stove. But I don't see the stove on. I don't see no lights on. And so I'm a little worried about what's going on. But I said, let's be open. And then they take a pot and they put it on the table and a sloppy Joe. Now, what's my whole point? My whole point to this is that have we ever really talked about words? There's too many times we have conversations with families. Too many times we have conversations with other people, and we're not talking about what words really mean to us. Let me give you some examples that are more to your work. When you start talking about high expectations. You ever used that at work? Ever heard that at work? So what you say, high expectations to a family who has a child who has a lot of learning difficulties and comes home with a C, and you're thinking it should be an A if they would just focus more, is that really they missed the high expectation? I work with a group of teachers, and one teacher defined high expectations as giving your best effort. The other one defined it as truly A students who go over and beyond. And they both were 7th grade teachers. So imagine a child who goes to this classroom, who works as hard as they can for you, and you give them an A for effort. Then I come over here, and I get in your classroom, and I work as hard as I can, and I got a C. We're confusing people because we're not being clear on our terms. But then we started talking about working with families. And we started trying to define the word family. I remember once when I was the supervisor of a residential program, and we had a Native American family visiting. And we told them to do your family visit, you can bring your family. You know how many people showed up? 57. 57 people. Now, this happened on a Saturday. This is I was supervising the program. So my staff were calling me going, we got 57 people here. What are we supposed to do? We just asked for their family. Right then and there, I stopped and I realized, I said, their family is there. We need to accommodate. How many times do we think about that when we're talking to our families we're working with? We started talking about expectations. We started talking about how do you define your family. We started talking about what's good for you to do. Are we really asking them for clarity back and forth? Think about that when you're having conversations. Even for those in this room who are supervisors. What do you really say to your staff? Are you giving them clear expectations when they work with the families? Are they doing their jobs? You know, when I do this activity, which I don't have time to do, I do a longer activity, and I ask, especially supervisors, do your meetings start at 9, 9:10, or 8:50, and do your staff know it? We work for a lot of people who always want to say, be here on time, but they never say what on time means. And then I really laugh when I get the supervisor who says 9 o'clock and I want my staff to be this way, but yet when we go work with families, it's okay to call them and say, I'm going to be late. Linguistics are really important because the families we work with will catch on real fast what we really mean versus what we think we mean. So if we're not clear about when we talk to people, we make all kinds of cultural mistakes. Just because what I think a family means something is not what my family I'm working with understands it to mean. When I start saying high expectations or excellence or you did good job today without giving definition behind that, I am not communicating well. Let me stop again before I go on. Does that make sense for people? Still with me? Like I said, if you got questions, please push back. All right, hey, on this graph here, and I can send this graph to you. One of the other things I realize is that the more we talk about culture, we want to mix it up with race. Race and culture are not the same. Now, if we can be really pointed, we can be honest and talk about race is really a mythological thing that's been created to create separation for economic and political power purposes. If we really want to be honest. But the danger is in our society, we keep falling into the trap to think because somebody does this and they look like that, it makes sense, it connects. But we need to understand that's not true. We need to understand, one of the things I say to people, look at the sales of hip-hop music. We always want to say that's just, be honest, a black thing. White, upper class, youth is where that money is being made. We always want to talk about only those artists who are making money are from this area. From Detroit, Eminem is a great example of somebody who was raised in a different culture and embraced that culture. But the sad thing is, the stereotypes that go with that all go to black. And we need to understand this is a really important thing, that when we have conversations with our families or in our workplace, we've got to stop making the whole assumption that, oh, because of they this, that makes sense. That's all right. That's a great reminder, even for myself, to stop and say, is my phone on vibrate? That's a great reminder. Thank you. We worked on that before the training started. No, but seriously, I really want us to stop and think about that. It's too many times we define culture and race as the same thing, and we need to move away from that. We need to really check ourselves. So I get a lot of it when I work with youth. and I get a youth who's a black male and says, my friends tease me because they say I talk white because I won't talk in slang. And that really disheartens me. Because talking a certain way does not define somebody as black or white. It defines their culture. We need to understand that. We need to help the families we work with that their skin color does not put them in a pigeonhole about who they are. So on this graph here, I really want to stress the fact that if you really want to talk about culture, you need to understand it's about traditions, beliefs, and values that we practice. So here's a great example. Once again, I grew up in Chicago, and now I live in Grand Rapids. And I can tell you, in Chicago, to be a fireman or a policeman is like being a lawyer or a doctor. But in Grand Rapids, it's not. That's culture. That is culture. So even when we start talking about looking at a family, how do they celebrate? That tells you a lot about their culture. Activities they do. I have friends from the East Coast and the West Coast, and my friends from the Midwest. I have a lot of friends from the Midwest or Atlanta who say, I ain't never learned how to swim. And it's a fallacy that goes around that black people don't like to swim. And then I talk to my friends from the West Coast, or I talk to my friends from Philly who grew up, and swimming was what they did. When the winter months came around, they joined the local Y and they swam. And they swam competitively. So are you asking your families when you start thinking about culture, what do they do for leisure activities? A couple things. Health. A lot of people want to say, oh, I have a friend who's a dentist, and he told me about he went to a workshop once, and they would always talk about how people of color got bad teeth, and they don't want to do this, and they don't want to do that. I said, but do you understand the culture of poverty? When I have to really sit down and start saying, am I going to eat? Am I going to pay my bills? Or I'm going to make sure we get all our dental appointments in this year. This is real. I joke about it a little bit, but here's the thing I said to my friend who's a dentist. I said, go talk to your friends in the Appalachian Mountain area, where poverty is just as real as it is in an urban city. And you ask me, how many of those families are going, our dental plan is number one. You know what? We didn't pay our rent this month. I'm a little leaner because I haven't been eating as much. But man, my teeth are on top. They're not. So as he did that, and I got back with him about 6 months later, he said, you know what, Sid, you're right. I realized the families of color I work with who had bad dental issues were the same as the poor white families I work with. So my point is, once again, don't mix culture and race together. It can happen so quickly. Look at your grocery stores. Look at your aisles of magazines from one area of town to the other area of town. We do it all the time and everywhere. So I'm going to just pick on one other thing, and I'm going to move on, is that, we start talking about your spiritual. Spiritual is a cultural thing. Like you talked about Bethel. You go, and I'll be honest, you can go out east to predominantly black Methodist churches, and you won't hear none of this. You're not going to hear this. It's very formal. That doesn't mean they're not black. That's their spirituality. You go down south, you walk by a church, and you hear this rhythm going. You walk in, it's all white people. That's real. But once again, we've bought into the trap of believing that culture and race are the same. We have got to be, especially when you start talking about working with families. You start talking about trying to create a sense of hope. We've got to be the ambassadors of saying, let's change this. This is wrong. Let's get it right. Questions before we move on? Questions at all? All right, now, one of the last things I'm going to go into before we start doing some activities about talking about inclusion. Inclusion means to be a part of the work and not a bystander. Prepare to be at the table. So if you have an organization, who's talking a lot about inclusion, one of the things I always say to them, I said, do you know your 3 Ps? And that's the policy, practice, and perception. So if you have an organization who's talking about, yeah, we really want to be inclusive, we want to get people involved, but you don't understand what your policies are, and I'll give you an example. Policy might say we can't wear open-toe shoes at work. But the practice is on the 3rd floor, we wear open-toe shoes at work all the time. The perception is that you don't mess with people on the 3rd floor. So if you want to have a policy that says one thing, but the practice is different and the perception is different, you're all messed up. So if you want to really be inclusive, you need to ask yourself, what policies do you have to make your workplace inclusive? Then do you really practice them? And then you need to ask yourself, which is a tougher question, what's the perception from the people who work here about that policy? Do they really see it happening? Because a lot of times I go to organizations and they say, yeah, we're all about diversity. Look at all the people we hired. We got Jimmy in accounting. Got Sally. You know Sally, she's biracial. You know? And then I talk to the other people who work there, and they say, those people are just tokens. They'll never ask them nothing. They never include them. You know, they knew they didn't have no female in IT, so they hired her, and she's an administrative assistant. But they call her part of the IT department. They say, yeah, she does the same things we do. So you see what I'm saying? You can have a policy in place. You can do some really false practices, and they create really bad perceptions, so you're just killing yourself. So if you really want to be inclusive, that's the first thing you got to ask yourself. What really is your policy? Is it really practiced, and what's the perception of it? Then I'm going to give you 3 other key things about inclusion right here. 1, voice. If I have somebody in my organization that I really want to be inclusive to, they got to have a voice. Too many times we say, oh, we hired this person from this demographic to be part of our organization, but they have no voice. They just sit over there, and we put them on all our advertisement. You know, they're in every picture that we send out, but they have no voice. The other thing is vote. There's too many times, especially when I work with families, we talk about this a lot, is that we need to give them a vote. So we start talking about making a change in their life, in their family structure, and we have not asked them to give a real vote, we're not being inclusive. We need to understand that. Families need to have a vote, especially if you want to be inclusive to any group and you're not giving them opportunity to have a real vote. I'm not talking about a vote where all 3 of us know we're going to do this and we say, oh, what do you think? Okay, we outvoted you. A real vote is sitting down, asking their opinion, and letting them say, this is what I want to have happen. The last point is validation. Don't ask me to be part of something and not know who I am and what I can bring to the table. Please don't ask me to be part of something just by what I look like. When I'm at the table, validate me by allowing me to be part of the table. Allow me to have a voice at the table. Allow me to share my gifts at the table. Allow me to find a place at the table where I have something to offer. Too many times, once again, we put these groups together and we say we got to have somebody from this demographic, and that demographic. We put them all at the table, but those people sit there, and other than the fact that they look like what we needed, we don't even know what skills they have. Maybe they should be running the meeting. Maybe they should be doing the minutes. Maybe they should be the one doing out the marketing plan rather than go out and outsource it and hire somebody else. That's validation, taking the time to find out what skills I have at this table. So voice, listen to me. Vote. Give me a real vote, not a joke vote. Validation. Know my skills. Know my skills. All right, so we're going to stop because at this point I really want to get into some activities. And so I'm going to turn it over to Karen, and then I'm going to come back. So
how's everybody doing today? Good? Everybody's doing good? Good lunch? Who liked that buffalo chicken hot sauce stuff? Yeah, it was gooey. It was gooey and hot. That was good. Yeah. Well, this may be your chance right now. This may be your moment right now. My name is Ernesto Todd Morales, and I'm a doctoral candidate at Michigan State University. I actually have all 3 of my degrees from Michigan State University. And I grew up in Lansing, 2 miles from campus. Yeah, there you go. On the banks of the Red Cedar, that's where I grew up at, yeah.
My wife went to state, I won't hold that.
Thanks. So, yeah, I grew up in Lansing. I've had a really good time listening to all the conversations. I apologize for not participating more earlier. I was still kind of shuffling around my slides and trying to figure out exactly how I wanted to present the information that I'm going to present to you. But I want to tell you a little bit about myself, since everybody else has spent so much time talking about themselves, and I can see that you all feel very comfortable with each other, and I think that's really cool. I'm also a social worker. My master's degree is in social work. And like I said earlier, I got that from Michigan State. I didn't go into the service provider track at all, though. I concentrated more on organizational and community practice, which is more in line with my background as an organizer, a community organizer for many years. Growing up in Lansing, I lived with my mother, who was white. My father's Mexican, but I grew up with a stepfather, and my stepfather is black. His name was Jim Padden, and actually I noticed on the list that many of you work at juvenile detention. And that's what my father did for a living. He was a juvenile detention provider, officer. I'm not exactly sure that part of it, but he did it for many, many years, for 25, 30 years. He just passed away a couple of years ago. But it was always interesting listening to the stories that would happen when he came home. He started there as the janitor, and by the time he left, he was training people coming out of college how to work with youth in juvenile detention. So I thought it was kind of cool when I saw where everybody was at for today. What we're going to talk about today is I'm going to talk to you about culture, but I'm going to talk to you, I think, about it in a sort of a different way, right? Because lots of times in our culture, what we do is we really focus in on the individual, right? In the United States, the individual is primary. Okay, and so when we talk about culture, as we did earlier today, in 2 what I thought were very interesting activities, we talked about our names, we talked about where the different experiences that have kind of brought us to this point, but we talked about it as individuals, right? This is what happened to me. This is a part of what I consider my individual culture. What we don't talk about in this country lots of times are the sort of macro effects of culture, right? Because we have also giant group cultures that don't have anything to do with us necessarily as an individual, right? And when I say that, I guess what I'm saying is this. We tend to use individuals as examples. We tend to use individuals as examples of why a culture is good or it's bad. And that's the way that we would frame it to each other, right? Individuals cannot be used as a reference for culture. That is impossible. It's not possible, because it's not possible for one person to be representative of an ethnic group or a culture or anything like that. There are years and years, centuries, millennium of history that goes into making a culture. And so part of what we're going to talk about today, and I'm really going to focus on the indigenous aspect of it, because it's what I study, and I think it's probably the best way for me to talk to you about it. We're going to talk about conquest, colonization, and indigenous resistance through culture. So what we're going to do is we're going to start in Europe, and we're going to start in the 1400s. The 1400s, the late 1400s, the early 1500s. What's going on in the world, in Europe, in the late 1400s? Who's fighting with each other? Who's in charge? Who wants to be in charge? There's 2 countries. This is very important to everything that we do in this country today is very important. What two countries? England and Spain were fighting for world domination at the end of the 14th century, going into the 15th century. You know what else happened at the end of the 14th century? The printing press was invented. Now, why is that important? Language. But what did the printing press do for language? Somebody said printed it. What else? It produced books. Were they producing books before? Longhand, right? Okay, so here, they told me this had a laser pointer on it. I'm very excited about that. They're saying that by 1500, printing presses in operation throughout Western Europe had already produced more than 20 million volumes. That is just like the internet today, where I think mostly, probably almost everybody, maybe except for Jamie, grew up in a household that didn't have a computer. And it wasn't because there was a digital divide, it's because people didn't have computers in their houses. Nobody had, I mean, that was something that they had on a military base, was a computer, right? So you go from having no books to millions of books. Printing presses created what we know today as the English language, the French language, the Italian language, because what they did was they codified spelling, they codified way of grammar, they made all of these things official. Because up until that point, you just spelled a word however you wanted to spell it, right? And then everybody just kind of sounded it out. And that was cool because that's the way that you did it. Okay, so you got two things that are happening at this moment. You have England and Spain who are slugging it out, literally, for domination of the known world. You have the printing press, where all of these ideas and these experiences are just exploding across the globe. People are reading them. Nations are being formed. What you have, and these are the things that are really important for us to remember. If we think about the printing press, the very first thing that's printed is what? Well, it's one of the first things that's printed. The Bible, right? It makes sense, okay? So, we also the Black Legend. Is anybody familiar with what this is about? The Black Legend was the sort of myths or the legends that the English concocted about the Spaniards, right? That they were barbaric, that they were ugly, that they were racially not the same as the English, that they were Catholic, therefore devil worshippers and all these other things, okay? And so what happens is that as the printing press becomes more important and as it begins to produce more, this sort of idea about who the Spanish is or who the Spanish are or were continues or starts to become more and more solidified, right? And then you have, and you have this, Christians coming to the New World with a metaphysical view of the world, okay? In other words, as Christians, and I grew up here in the United States, so I have to place myself within that framework, right? As Christians, we are taught certain things about the world. And one of the things that we're taught about the world is this, that all of us are sinners, that our essential nature is sinful, that we have somehow made some type of mistake. All have sinned, fall short of the glory of God. That's why Jesus came. It's an act of redemption. Through one man, I'm pretty sure that this is what Romans 5:12 says, that through one man sin entered into the world, therefore all have sinned. Okay, that is a metaphysical view of the world, is an essentializing act of human nature. All right, what that says is, no matter what we do, we can't change that because that's who we are. All right, now we can try to be better and we can try to live good lives and stuff like that, but this is what we are, okay? And this is what is coming across the ocean to the Americas. The English arrived in the Americas almost 100 years after the Spanish. The Spanish landed in the Americas in 1492. It was 95, 96 years later that the English arrived here to create their first colony. Now think about that, okay? That means that for 100 years, for almost a century, the English had been reading about the Spanish conquest of the Americas. They had been reading all of the accounts that had come back about these giant civilizations and about indigenous thought and about indigenous religion and how it stacked up against what they knew as Europeans. I mean, they didn't really think of themselves as Europeans, but as people come from England or Spain. But they did think of themselves as Christian, which is primarily the way when the Spanish and the English arrived here, primarily the way that they made distinctions between themselves and the indigenous people that were here. They would say, we're Christian and you're not, okay? So, there's a debate that took place in 1542. And I'll let you read this while I want to read this to you. This is written by a gentleman named Roberto Rodriguez. He's a professor at the University of Arizona. He says that when Europeans first arrived to Anahuac, which is now called Mexico, within a couple of years, 12 Franciscan friars joined their armed brethren in an attempt to conquer what is known as the Americas. Soon after the arrival of these friars, they summoned indigenous representatives for a theological debate in Tenochtitlan, or what we now know as Mexico City. In fact, it was not a true debate, but rather an opportunity for these European friars to lecture indigenous people about their theology. And he goes on to say that, for this purpose, the most notable exchange had to do with whether the indigenous representatives knew God. At this point, one of the friars explained, and it's up here. Is somebody here speak Spanish? Speak it well? Better than me. Read this for us. Because my Spanish is terrible. Just read it out loud for us. Start with the Spanish part. Yeah.
Él es el verdadero y AmIndianCultComp, al cual vosotros llamáis, pero nunca lo habéis conocido.
Okay, so the translation, and I can read the translation, it's translated to this. He is the one, he is the true one, and whom you call Yipal-Nimoani, right? Yeah, but you never really knew him. Okay. Ipa-Nimoani is often translated as that for which we live. Okay? This is a word for God. All right? But it's not God. It's a word for God. It's a word that means that for which we live. So, there's a little bit of a difference going on here. There's a debate. And the debate is, are indigenous people human? Because if they're not human, then they don't have a soul, and it doesn't matter what we do to them. Do they know God? These are the debates that are happening at this time, and these are the debates that the English are reading about, that the Spanish are having during that 100-year period, right? So what we have going on very clearly is a battle, two different worldviews. Despite this admission, never mind the conclusion thereafter, this idea that you never really knew him is codified and documented in European books written by friars between the 1500s and the 1700s, that indigenous people were godless and under the sway of the devil. To this day, as determined by the Spanish priests, this has become the sordid story of this continent. This is the metaphorical first sin of the first peoples of the continent. But unquestionably, throughout the 500 plus years of European presence on this continent, and even now, this idea has not played out metaphorically, but rather in real life and often in violent terms. Of note, the concept of the devil did not even exist in the Americas. It arrived with those from across the sea, who apparently saw it everywhere and virtually in everything, including human beings, animals, nature, and science. They also saw that it was a cause and explanation for everything negative or not in accord with their beliefs and understandings. So, now one of the sort of concepts that I think is really important, because what it does is it kind of helps to set the framework when we talk about culture, right, is this idea, or this idea of Hunabku is a mathematical equation of the universe, right? It's Mayan. He says, of note, this is Rodriguez again talking, there are no statues or images of Hunabku, although it was represented as a mathematical formula of a square or a pyramid inside of a circle. This is in stark contrast to the West that thinks of God as an elderly man sitting in a big chair. In part, the explanation of this difference is that the Maya conceived of Hunabku and the universe in mathematical as opposed to metaphysical terms. The Mayan concept of God was a scientific concept. Literally, it was a mathematical equation. It was how the universe works. It wasn't about metaphysics. There wasn't an essentializing of human nature that was going on. They thought of it more in what we would call material terms. Guillermo Bonfil Batalla is a Mexican anthropologist. He's passed away, but he wrote a book called Mexico Profundo, which is a very interesting book because in his book, what Bonfil Batalla says is that there's a permanent confrontation that's going on in the Americas. And it's a cultural confrontation sometimes. Sometimes it's not a cultural confrontation. Sometimes it's a military confrontation. But he's saying that there is two competing worldviews in the Americas, and that one of them is Mesoamerican and one of them is Western. And that it will continue until one of them actually gains ascendancy. So when we talk about this permanent confrontation, when we talk about culture here in the Americas, one of the things that's really important to keep in mind is corn, right? Why is corn important? It's main food, that's true. Yep, it was at one time, it still is. We eat a lot of corn, high fructose corn syrup. Where's corn start at? Let me ask you, let's take one step back even further. Why can I say to you, where was corn invented? Any farmers in here? No farmers, no corn farmers in here? Who said they lived in Iowa? I heard somebody talking about that earlier, that they had been in Iowa. Now they're denying it? Right? I was like, I know I heard that, yeah. So let me tell you something. I used to live in Iowa. I lived in Iowa for like a year. I was there with my dad, and I worked on a farm with him. And we used to detassel corn. And detasseling corn, you have to go down these corn rows, and you can only do it by hand. They don't have a machine that can do it because it messes up the plants. So you go down these rows, and you pull out the top part of the corn plant. And what it does is it allows the other plants, the male plants, to fertilize them, to pollinate them and to fertilize them. Corn is the only crop on the face of this planet that has to have human intervention to grow. It's the only one. Corn is an invention. It's an invented food. It's the first GMO, the very first one. Where was it invented? It was invented in Mesoamerica, right? And so Mesoamerica is in the middle of Mexico, right? But corn and corn civilization is where? It's all over this continent, okay? Corn culture, all right, is overwhelming evidence of continental communication. Now, was it instantaneous communication? No. Did it take time? Yes. Did these ideas and these thoughts and this crop spread out all over the continent? Absolutely. And part of the point that's being made then is that culture is based in material surroundings. All right? The kind of culture that we have, or the kind of culture that we think that other people have, is completely derived from their material surroundings. I heard somebody talking about it earlier, about a culture of poverty. Okay? Culture is materially based. All cultures are based in material. And so when we think about people who are oppressed, when we think about people that are poor, right, what is the production of that culture? Because all cultures have to produce something. That's what cultures do. That's what society does. It produces things. But if you If your culture is based in material surroundings and you don't have anything that's material to build with, then what do you produce? Maybe. Yeah, babies. Okay, babies. All right. Cultural production then becomes what remains, in this case, to indigenous people. But the point is that these ideas or this thought is applicable across the whole spectrum of the work that we do. So culture, and we're talking about culture, we're not talking about tradition, because tradition is the death of culture. Now, why would tradition be the death of culture? That's right. You cannot change it. You said change, right? Tradition is culture dead. So when people start talking about traditional this and traditional that and all this other thing, what they're really saying is we've come to the end of this practice. This is it. It has been defined. There is no more that we can think about or do about with this. And it's the same thing with the cultures that we see erupting around us. The Spanish in Mexico established a new political, economic, and religious system or order based on military might. This system is called colonization. They came to the New World, to the Americas, and they militarily crushed all of the governments that were here. There's no other way to say it. They militarily crushed them. They physically subjugated the people that were here, and after that, they instituted new economic and religious systems. And they kept them in force through arms, initially. So when we ask this question, what is colonization? Colonization is literally the total disruption of the political, economic, and cultural development of a people. You have a group of people who have been coexisting for thousands and thousands of years and who have a religious system and schools, and they build cities, and they do all these other things, and then all of a sudden these other people come and they just wreck it all. They wreck it all, they kill everybody, and they say, no, that's not the way we're going to do it anymore. That is a total disruption. It's over. It's done. So, genocide is a byproduct of colonialism. It's not why the Spaniards came here. It's not why the English came here. They didn't come here to murder people in mass. They came here because economic exploitation is the main reason for this system. They came here to get rich. And they're still doing that. 520 years later, that's still what's happening. And in fact, it's some of the same families. 520 years later, that's still what's going on. So when we talk about getting to the root of an issue, I mean, it's important to understand or to look at how we interact with the immediate world around us on an individual level. That's absolutely important. But it's also important to understand that there are larger issues in terms of why groups of people have the kind of lives that they do. So colonialism establishes hegemony. Hegemony is a Greek word. It's from the Greek word hegemon, which means king. It really first comes into play in the writings of an Italian Marxist named Antonio Gramsci. What hegemony does, though, see, hegemony is really cool, because hegemony is one of those. It's what takes over after military force, right? Because why? How do I ask you this question? Why do we tell little kids if they're lost, they should find a police officer? And I'm not trying to be like whatever about the police. I mean, this is like literally. Why do we tell kids that? Because everybody knows, right, that that's someone that they can trust. Okay, I totally agree with your statement. It's common sense. Everybody knows that that child can trust that police officer. All right, that's hegemony. Right? Because if I were to stand up here and say to you that the police are not your friends, right? That maybe perhaps that child shouldn't go to a police officer. Almost everybody in this room would be like, what's that guy talking about? Like, you would completely dismiss my statement. It would be almost like you didn't even hear it, like it couldn't go in your ear because it was just too ridiculous, right? That's hegemony. Hegemony establishes social control, not military control. So after you go in and you kick everybody's butt and you tear down all the temples and you burn up all the books and you eliminate all the leaders, okay? You don't need as many soldiers around, because then what you do is you round up everybody that's there and you say, all you're going to go to church, okay? And then we're going to teach you everything that you need to know right here. And this is what you need to know in order to survive. And that's the first generation. And so then the first generation says to the second generation, don't cause any problems, because we see what happens here when people cause problems. And then the third generation, and then the fourth generation, and by the fifth and sixth generation, you don't need anybody to tell you not to act up, because you're just not going to do it, because it doesn't make any sense to rock the boat. That's hegemony. That's what colonization does. So, we're going to go back a little bit more and talk a little bit about the differences. Indigenous cultures in the Americas are based in observation of the material world. You see, you describe. They are scientific knowledge systems, and they're based in the scientific method. Think about Hunabku. Hunabku is a mathematical equation of the universe, how the stars move. Indigenous languages are verb-based. Now, what do I mean by verb-based? What's that?
Action.
Action, right? So, somebody give this chair a name describing what it does. Somebody want to take a crack at it? Not what it is, what it does.
It's a sitting vessel.
Okay, a sitting vessel, all right. He for whom which we live, that for which we live, right? Not God, that for which we live. That for which we sit, all right? So we're using multiple words, what we would consider words, right? Because the way that we look at this, we say this is a chair, this is a man, that is a woman, all right? This is a man, that's it. He's man. This is a woman, okay? And there's nothing in between. Because that's the description of this, that's the description of this. All right, that's who they are. It's not what they do. It's not the action that they perform, right? Because men perform multiple actions, right? Women perform multiple actions, right? This is an essentializing. When I say this is a man and this is a woman, that is a metaphysical essentializing of what these are. Because that's what they are, and that's all they'll ever be. That's what they do. So indigenous languages are verb-based languages. Every word describes an action, right? So when we talk about scientific knowledge systems and based in scientific method, what is the scientific method? When you're engaged in scientific inquiry, what's the first thing you do? Okay, you observe, and then what do? Hypothesis. I thought I heard somebody say hypothesis. Okay, and then after that, you test it, and then you make your conclusion, right? Okay. Verb-based languages do that regularly. That's what it means to talk about what something does as opposed to what it is. You are not who you are, but what you do. Okay, this slide should not be here. That slide is definitely in the wrong spot. But it's a cool slide. Let's see. And we may come back to it later if I can remember where it's at. Yeah. It's definitely the wrong spot. So, we talk about Mesoamerica, we talk about Western civilization, All right. When we talk about Mesoamerica, what we're really talking about is corn culture or maize culture. And it is a culture that exists all over the continent, right? All over the Americas. Our presence in this discussion is evidence of that permanent confrontation. Because if that confrontation didn't exist, then I wouldn't be here talking to you about it, because there wouldn't be anything to talk about. So, we're gonna run through these real quick. How much time do I have left? Oh, there's a clock right there. Okay. Anybody familiar with what's happening in Tucson, Arizona, with the Mexican American Studies program there? Yeah? Karen? Bandit. Can't do it. Why is that? Okay. All right. I want you to watch this clip with me real quick. This is a clip from The Daily Show. It aired on April 2nd of this year. And it's just a few minutes, just kind of let it wash over you. That's probably the best way to really describe it. And listen to the man, not to this man, to the other white guy. Listen to him very carefully.
Your children's education. Nothing is more important. You want them to learn enough to do well in the world, but not so much that they can win arguments with you. But what are they really learning in school? How magical. Follow this eye-opening story.
Across the country, public education is failing. But in Arizona, lawmakers have found the solution to the biggest problem facing their schools.
Arizona's Governor Jan Brewer just approved a bill banning ethnic studies classes in public schools.
And using this new law, the Tucson School Board banned the K-12 Mexican American Studies program. School Board member Michael Hicks.
My concern was a lot of the radical ideas that they were teaching in these classes, telling these kids that this is their land, the whites took it over, and the only way to get out from beneath the gringo, which is the white man, is by bloodshed.
When you sat in on these classes, what types
I
of...
chose not to go to any of their classes. Why even go? Why even go? I base my thoughts on hearsay from others, so I basically thought
With powerful evidence like hearsay, the Tucson School Board had little choice but to end the Mexican American Studies program, protecting kids from dangerous teachers like Curtis Acosta.
Our students are much more likely to graduate, go to college, their test scores have improved, and most of all, they're excited about education so they can pursue it in their future lives.
And you do that by teaching them to hate white people.
We don't teach them to hate white people. What we're trying to do is provide a more complex version of what has happened in our past so that our students are engaged and they can ask themselves critical questions and build their own understanding.
Critical thinking, more like critical brainwashing, and it gets worse.
they would every week go out and buy burritos and feed these kids.
What?
Yeah. What that does is it builds a more of a bond between the teacher and the students.
Sure, I'm loyal to this guy because he bought me burritos.
Right.
And you slip your burritos to kids, don't you?
Why would be giving food to our youth be something that frowned upon?
When the program goes away, the burritos go away. That's why these kids are upset. No mas burritos.
It's pretty offensive.
And now that they've eradicated Mexican American studies from the schools, they can focus on other ethnicities.
Honestly, this law won't be applied to any other of our courses. It was strictly written for one course, which is the Mexican American Studies program. And nobody has complained about any of the Pan-Asian or any of the other courses that are being taught.
What about the African American Studies program?
The African American Studies program is still there. It's not teaching the resentment of a race or class of people.
I'm a black kid. Try to teach me about slavery without me feeling resentment towards white people.
How am I going to teach you about slavery? Slavery was...
How did I end up here?
Slavery was Okay. The white man did bring over the Africans.
What kind of jobs did we do?
The jobs that you guys did was basically slavery jobs.
So after we were free, we got to vote?
Yes. You didn't get to vote until later.
And we were equal?
Almost equal.
What, we were like sort of a half or 3/5?
My personal perception of it, I would say you're probably a quarter.
The more he taught me about black history, the more I realized Arizona has figured out the right way to teach it.
We now have a black man as a president. You know, Rosa Clark did not take out a gun and go onto a bus and hold up everybody.
Sadly, the peaceful lessons of Rosa Clark are lost on the radical reactionaries teaching Mexican-American studies.
I think this is a great country. In some countries, I might be actually locked up for teaching the way I have, and well, in this country, I'm just banned from doing it.
Very close to your mind. Until then, Arizona's children can count on professional educators like Michael Hicks to protect them.
Do you think it'll be okay for the school district to have a Mexican-American Studies program when the district is 100% Latino?
No.
But at that point, there'll be no white people left.
Well, if there's no more white people in the world, then okay, then you can do what you want.
Oh, don't worry, Mr. Hicks. We will.
So what's really at play here? There's racism, okay, but I'm going to tell you that's the short answer, okay. What's at play here? There are bigger forces at play here than racism. What's that?
Arrogance, pressed up by ignorance.
Okay, I heard somebody.
Loss of control or authority.
Oh, you're right on top of it.
We know that the Hispanic population will be growing in this country, and they're going to have to see power at some point in Arizona, Texas.
This is where this slide belongs, right there, right? Okay, because when we talked about earlier, you're absolutely right. We talked about hegemony. We talked about social control, right? We talked about what happens after they put the guns away, okay? There's a little cage that we all live in, okay? But it's an invisible cage because everybody knows that you can go talk to this guy and he's gonna help you, right? That's just common sense, right? We all of us know where the bars are. We absolutely know where the bars are. We know how far we can go. I know how far I can go in this discussion, right? Because there are some things that I'm just not gonna say, because they don't make any sense to say them right now, okay? So it's hard to see the invisible cage, right? But, what's your name, brother? Ken? Like Ken just said, if there's an invisible cage and we know who's in control, but then all of a sudden they start getting crazy, what does that mean? It means that they don't really feel like they're in control anymore. See, that's what's really happening in Arizona. What's really happening in Arizona is that there is a loss of control. Hegemony has been revealed. We can see the bars of the cage. And so everybody's all like, well, wait a minute, what's going on out there? What's that over there? That's where I want to be. I want to be outside of the cage. I don't want to be in the cage. So Mexican American Studies in Tucson, and I tell you this as a Chicano Studies scholar, is absolutely the most successful educational program in the history of Chicanos, which started in 1848. There weren't any Chicanos before 1848, because in 1848, the Mexican-American War ended, and the northern part of Mexico became the southwestern part of the United States. The most successful program, hands down. Hands down. 95% graduation rate, 80% matriculation rate to college. Unheard of. The national graduation rate for Chicanos, Mexican Americans in this country is 45%. They were graduating on a routine basis, 95% of their students, and 80% of them were going to college. And as a result of this amazing success, the state of Arizona passed the law, HB 2281, which makes it illegal to teach Mexican American studies in Arizona. In any school that receives public funding, it makes it illegal. And why does it make it illegal? Because of this. That's why it makes it illegal. Because if everywhere else it's 45%, here it's 95%, then there's something that's not right here. It's not the rest of the place where everything's wrong. Because if everywhere else it's this way, and in this one spot, it's completely opposite, then that means this one spot is an anomaly. It shouldn't be like that. So, HB 2281 is a hegemonic articulation of anti-indigenous thought. It's what it is. It is hegemonic articulation of anti-indigenous thought. Makes it illegal to teach, makes it illegal to think about it. And this is the one that I think is really this one is kind of the wrap up in terms of the way that really thinking about it. When we have programs that aren't successful, they just get defunded. We don't have money for that. You're going to have to disband your staff, blah, blah, blah. But they didn't defund this program. They made it illegal. They made it against the law. It is against the law to do this in Arizona. And it's against the law because these teachers, obviously, through whatever they taught, or however I think it's more the way they taught it, defied the power structure. They were teaching counter-hegemonic ideas. They were teaching ideas that went against hegemony. And their students were very vocal, and they fought back against these cuts and against the law. See, Chicano studies is dangerous because when it's done correctly, it makes the cage that we live in visible. That's why they passed a law there, because there was something about the way that they were teaching it that made it so that these kids could see what was happening around them. They were doing it mainly through literature. And why is literature important? Literature is thought, literally thought. It is theory. It is reflection on our state of being. It's how we think and see the world around us. Songs, poems, literature, this is all cultural production. When you have a group of people who have been conquered through military conquest, who have been denied basic education rights, who have been denied the resources of the country that they live in, so that they are no longer in control of the means of production, so that they're not the ones that are producing cars or planes or street signs or any of these other things, yet they still have a culture, and that culture still makes some sort of cultural production, then what's left for them to produce except for things like song and poem and literature? I mean, think about the things that all of us that are in this room are famous for, right? For our entertainment value, for our ability to sing or to dance or to tell jokes. You know, this is what's left to us. This is our cultural production. And so this is where our culture becomes centered in those things. And culture is, again, based on material surroundings. So if we grow up and we don't have control of any of these things, right, then the materiality of who we are becomes the poems, it becomes the songs, it becomes the literature. That's our materiality. Okay, don't get scared by the gun. This guy's, he left here a long time ago. He was a good brother. National liberation and culture. National liberation of a people is the regaining of the historical personality of that people. It is a return to history through the destruction of the imperialist dominion to which they have been subjected. Amilcar Cabral. He's serious, a scholar and a soldier. He's a very interesting man, one of my heroes. So you have this idea of a return to history. Actually, to tell you the truth, that right there, that is what I'm writing my whole dissertation about. There's no question about it. When I read this speech, where this comes from, where this quote comes from, I realized that was what I was going to write about. I was going to write about this return to history. Because what is colonization? What is conquest except for a disruption of history? And that's what Cabral is saying, right? Is that our history as indigenous people, your history as African people is disrupted, right? And the only way, and what we had before, we can't ever get back. And so this whole period of colonization, Cabral is saying, is this interruption, it's the interval between when we were a people with history, a people without history, and when we return to history. See, these are all parts of these ideas of culture. This is what culture does. Culture inevitably leads us to this return. Another hero of mine, Frantz Fanon. Fanon says that the response of the oppressed must be continental in breadth because colonialism is continental. So again, and the main reason I included this, is that it is appropriate to, for us and the people that we're working with to tell them and to require of them that they take personal responsibility for the things that they've done. There's no question about that. That is in fact, I think, a part of this, is us understanding as we come out of our own cultures of our own colonized cultures. Part of understanding is that we have to take responsibility as individuals, not just for ourselves, but for our community and for making this return happen. But what Fanon is saying is that we can't afford to be blocked off into little groups anymore, right? Because we're not a little group anymore. What we are as a result of colonization is a much larger grouping of indigenous people. And so, and this gets a little bit more sometimes within the indigenous community. This point's a little bit more, is made a little bit harder because people are still very sectioned off. You know, I'm a part of this group, I'm a part of this group, I'm a part of this group. But the reality is that colonialism is continental, and that the only way to overcome that, the only way to return to history, because we won't ever return to history as Mexica or Tlaxcalans or as Ojibwe or Potawatomi, that time period is over, right? We have to find a way to think about this on a continental level. So culture is dynamic and always changing, always changing. If a culture is no longer changing, then it is a dead culture. Declarations of indigeneity are important as they frame the struggle for cultural relevancy. So within the indigenous community, we have to make statements about indigeneity, right? We have to think about why these things are still relevant, and if they are still relevant, because there are some things that people do that aren't culturally relevant. They're not relevant at all. Everyone has a culture or participates in one. All culture is created by their material conditions. This process is repeated over and over again. We live within a system that makes this possible. Nobody escapes culture. Nobody. I've heard people, Karen was talking earlier about how she kind of had to come to grips with the fact that white people have a culture, right? Think about it in terms of hegemony. What is a greater moment of absolute hegemony than being able to say, I don't even have a culture. Like, I don't have a culture. I'm cultureless. Really? You're cultureless? Are you cultureless, or are you actually a part of the bubble? You know, because the bubble is still a part of the culture, right? So it's that being able to even just remove yourself even that one step further and saying, well, that's not me, that's you guys, because you guys are the ones that this happened to, right? You're the Indians that got killed off. You're the Africans that are descendants of slaves. It's you, but it's not us. We're not, you know, we're not a part of that. So with a system that's repeated over and over again. 2 books. I think these are good books to consider. This first one, Imagine Communities by Benedict Anderson. What he does is he talks about the impact of the printing press. And he talks about how the printing press shaped the modern world, and particularly Europe, in creating these countries. And then Mexico Profundo. Although with Mexico Profundo, I would just read the first 3 chapters. Because after that, it just gets into some, I don't know, just some crazy stuff. Has to do with very specific historical incidences that took place in Mexico. But the first 3 chapters are really him laying out his theoretical argument about this permanent confrontation. It's very, very, very interesting stuff. Any questions?
Well, Washington.
Thank you, Ken.
I mean, are you saying that they should return to history? Is that beneficial to them? I mean, you know, clearly in the Americas, the indigenous people suffered tremendous pain and suffering. You know, but were there any benefits in terms of changing the culture of the civilization? You know, does it allow them to, I guess, move ahead, so to speak, to the future?
I mean, we'll never know the answer to that question.
I mean, because you know, obviously they didn't have weapons like the Spanish did, guns. They weren't prepared to defend themselves against them. They were introduced to all the diseases, killed off a lot of people.
Yeah, I think that it's. I mean, I understand your question. I think it's kind of a hard question to really engage with for this reason. I mean, my immediate response would be that all of the things that happened, even if there was anything that was kind of good that came out of it, although I'm not really sure what that would be, because the history, I mean, just the history of indigenous people after initial contact is just, it's pretty bad. I mean, I can't really think of a Renaissance period at all. And there may be one in the future, but that would, again, be the sort of return. What Cabral is talking about in the return to history, and he's very clear about this, it is not a return to 500 years ago. It's not a return to, say, the way that people lived, before Europeans came, or because what Cabral is saying, and what all anti-colonial writers are saying, is that there's no way for us to really understand how people thought 500 years ago. We can kind of have an idea, and we do, because some of the language, a lot of the language is intact, and a lot of ideas are intact. But I mean, we are all products of our time period. I mean, if you or I were transported 100 years ago, 100 years back into the past, we would be in serious trouble, because we'd have no idea what was happening around us. I mean, literally, it would take a minute. And even at that, in some ways, you could even argue that our lives would be in danger immediately, because we just have a different way of interacting with all kinds of people. So what Cabral is saying is that this return to history is a future event, and that what it signifies is a re-recognition on the part of the colonized as to their as to the fact that they are a distinct grouping of people, and that they have a right to participate in the political events that are happening around them. And so when he says return to history, that's really what he's talking about. Yeah.
Then how does the process become corrupt?
Which process?
Well, I mean, I'm not familiar with the individuals listed, but
right.
They advocate, this colonialist, I guess, thought or what have you.
Mm-hmm.
But then we see, like in Africa, they're the advocates of the indigenous people, and they get in power, and then they do the same stuff.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you think about it like this. Here in the Americas, I mean, this period, I mean, let's just say for sake of argument or not, or for the sake of the discussion, we just call the last 520 years the colonial period, okay? But you think about 5 centuries of this is the way things are done, this is the way things are done, this is the way things are done. And I mean, that's a hard habit to break, and I think that's a big part of it, is that give you an example. I was at the Capitol on Tuesday, okay? So I was at the Capitol on Tuesday, and I heard all these people talking about unions and all this other kind of stuff. Okay, I've worked as a union organizer. I've been a member of a union. I've actually worked as a union organizer several times. I very much believe in unions, okay? Now I will tell you here that I think capitalism is a really bad idea. I don't see how it works, really, because I don't think it does work. Because when you have people who can starve to death on the street, while there are people who have billions and billions of dollars and will never want for anything, I mean, ever, you know, there is an in-between there that, in my mind, that is not rational. I can't accept that as, you know, like that's a good idea, because I don't necessarily need to be the guy with $1 billion. Like, I don't have that driving force in me or whatever. I don't know. But the point is this, is that when you're there and all these people are there, you never hear anybody say capitalism is bad. All they ever say is, we can fix this. But I don't think you can fix it. And I think it's the same thing with this, right? There's a lot of things that have happened in the last 520 years. Now, do they call for like blood revenge or, you know, this or that? No, they don't. And I wouldn't be a person that would want to exact that type of revenge. But that doesn't mean that we have to continue to say, we can fix it, we can fix it. At a certain point, you're gonna have to say, this don't work. This doesn't work. Colonialism doesn't work. You know, it doesn't work that in Tucson, Arizona, this fool can be on the school board and can say these types of things in all seriousness, you know, and people are like, yeah, Rosa Clark, yeah. Even if there was no more white people, you still can't have Mexican American studies. I mean, I was just like, what? It's just,
But isn't that called democracy? Then we have that person who has a forum to say those things.
okay, that's democracy. I mean, is democracy really all that great? I mean, you got 58 people in Lansing right now who will never face another election, or who are in their last election, who have just passed a law that says the right to work laws, and now they're working on what, Tina? The abortion bill. They're working on some other ones you were telling me about.
Now that is called corruption.
No, that's called democracy. That is, no, sister, that is democracy. That's what I'm saying, is that at a certain point, you have to say, this doesn't work, you know. And then, I mean, you know, then you kind of go from there. But the beginning of it is saying this doesn't work. But to understand it, I think you have to go back and you have to look at it on a macro level. Because as human beings, I mean, we require all kinds of fine tuning, and we require all sorts of interaction with each other. And these things are very important. It's important for us to sit down with each other and tell each other our stories on a human, basic level.
So are you an advocate of lobotomy?
Of what?
Lobotomy.
Not on myself. No, I don't know. I think lobotomies, that sounds bad to me. I'm like, But
I don't think a lot of people anticipated when they voted, you know what I'm saying, for their representatives and such. I mean, it's not until you know, give an actor a stage, you know, until he, you know, that's when he performs.
no, yeah.
They have this stage, they're performing, you don't like the show, okay, you gotta cancel the show.
Well, you gotta wait a couple years. You gotta do it, right? Or you gotta vote them out. You gotta do all these other things. I mean, but that's democracy, or that's the form of democracy that we've chosen to live under, right? And so, I mean, I vote in every election. I don't really think it makes a huge amount of difference, but I do it, you know. And so you have, but I mean, in a lot of people, what's that? What guy? Oh, that guy? Yeah, that's, oh, no. I vote in every election, sister. Yeah.
But voting, I mean, I've seen people that, you know, we discuss voting, that there's some folks that will vote and say, well, and it's sad, but not have an informed vote. They'll say, I can't pronounce his last name, I'm not voting for him.
Right.
Okay, I voted for too many women, I vote for a few men. And I mean, really, and just based on, and this is how people get elected.
Yeah.
You know, it's probably harder to get your name on the ballot than it is to get elected.
Yeah. Well, and this is, I mean, again, a lot of the concepts that we talked about in this conversation apply I mean, they apply from the back going forward. I mean, even in terms of hegemony, you know, I mean, looking at things a certain way. And this idea, I mean, let's apply it to democracy. This idea that democracy is the best political system that could ever exist, okay? I don't know if that's true. I'm not willing to sign off on that, you know, or that capitalism is the best economic system because sometimes people get rich. Sometimes people get rich.
The system is only as good as the people who administer it.
Okay. I mean, okay, you know, so, but this is the thing. So if you have, and again, take that and apply it back, you know, I mean, and so you look at these confrontations, you look at the way that you have two civilizations, two different civilizations that came in direct conflict with each other 520 years ago, right? One of them has at its very core the idea that human nature is fixed, and the other does not. It doesn't look at the world like that. That thought, that idea did not exist here in this continent at all. That human nature is fixed, that it's not in flux, that we're not, that we're developing, that we're a part of the world around us. Yeah.